Casey is best known as the leading advocate in the U.S. for a national and international plan to prepare for the next climate change, which he has predicted to be one of the most dangerous cold climate eras. I was fortunate enough to have heard him last year in February at the Agenda 21 conference, and I think some of you were at our Agenda 21 meeting that we held here on what the UN is trying to do to America. Mr. Casey will address this also. It is very pertinent for us to hear his message as he refutes Al Gore. And I had one of the school board members, I'm so glad that Mr. Bill Mathias was able to come, because I feel strongly that if the students can listen to Al Gore, they must listen to John Casey. So with that, I give him a warm welcome.
Thank you all. Let me do a little check here, because Vance has decided he's going to film me. I have to put my coat on. I have to not use any profanity today. And since you mentioned Al Gore, I automatically want to say a few choice words. We're going to see if this remote works first. Negative. We have no launch. Okay, if I may borrow this attractive lady here. I may need you to just push the down button when we move forward in the presentation. What's your name?
Marie.
Marie?
Oh, wait, the down button is...
Yeah, just the number 3 button, that's the down button.
Okay, all right.
Why don't you try that once, see if it works.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Marie's in charge then. Well, thank you very much. This is the first time I've stepped up to a podium and there's a check for me. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, no problem. Can you hear me in the back? No. I should speak up?
Yes.
Okay, is there a volume control that we can help? Oh, it's all the way up. Okay, I'll have to speak closer to the mic. Marie's ready? Everyone's ready? Okay, great. Well, thank you all for having me here. It's always a pleasure to come to beautiful Mount Dora. My wife and I are looking for a new place to move to, and I keep telling her Mount Dora is a great place to be, so don't be surprised if you see me standing on a street corner with a sign saying, "I don't like Al Gore." Today we have much to talk about. And how much time would you like me to spend today?
About half an hour, 45 minutes.
Half an hour, 45 minutes. And what I'd like you to do, if we could, just make note of any questions you have, and at the end we'll try to get to those. But we've got a lot to get through today. The presentation subject, of course, is the next climate change and some recent developments that are affecting all of us here in the state of Florida and nationally. As you can see from the outline, we have a number of specific subjects to get into. I'm going to talk to you about my book, Cold Sun, and the Global Climate Status Report that my organization publishes every quarter. The organization is called the Space and Science Research Corporation. It's a small office in Orlando that interconnects with scientists around the world, and it is that international team that is actually the Space and Science Research Corporation. We communicate daily on the status of the Earth's climate, where it's going, and what the truth of the climate is. Today, you will hear the truth, and for most of you, it will be a truth you've never heard before. You certainly wouldn't have heard it on the evening news or the print medium. That includes my own hometown, Orlando Sentinel, which refuses to tell the truth about the climate. You'll see this wherever you go in the mainstream media. They are simply not telling you the truth. We will talk about the Earth's climate status. We'll talk about rising temperatures and the predictions for sea level forecast that we've had to deal with for years. And we'll also talk about what's coming with the next climate, what the effects will be, and more recent developments a news conference I chaired at just outside of Miami on August the 21st, where we announced the schedule for and depth of the coming global drop in sea level, which will stay with us for decades. So sea level is going to end. Sea level rise is going to end. We'll talk about the President's November the 1st executive order, whereby he pulled all of the federal government's climate management team into one organization. And we'll talk also about a very recent development whereby 15 organizations in the state of Florida have joined together with over 15,000 members and called on the Attorney General of Florida to launch an investigation into man-made climate change abuses by Florida officials. This is a very important development. We believe it will affect elections that are coming forward here in the state of Florida. We believe it will affect much of the governance that we see, especially down in southeast Florida, where you have such a preponderance of organizations and people who want to take control of property, who want to take control of lives and people's futures down there. I'm sure you all are well aware of that already. Next slide, Mary.
Mary. Oh. Pay attention over there.
Since I'm a scientist slash engineer slash researcher, that means by definition I have no sense of humor. So I have to bring it in. Here's my humor for the day.
Okay.
This is from Mr. Payne, one of the best political cartoonists at Detroit News. He's unabashed in his acknowledgement that mankind has no impact on the climate, and he routinely comes up with great cartoons like this. It talks about a lecture that was scheduled on the dangers of global warming, and then, of course, a sign slapped across it saying it's postponed because of the obvious 4 or 5 feet of snow outside. In the last 5 winters, we've had 3 near-record winters, and we're about to see a lot more records being set in the future. This is my book, the front cover. I have it over here, which you can pick up after our presentation. I'll be glad to sign that for you as well. And most importantly, this climate science book, Cold Sun, talks about why our climate is changing and what our climate future will be. In chapter 5 of the book, it gives 33 reasons why you should believe that global warming has ended and a new cold climate has begun. The comments you see on the right side of the screen, however, come from prominent scientists and other experts around the world. This book has received international acclaim by other scientists, and I'm very proud of that. I've never seen the amount of scientists with the careers of these gentlemen and ladies who stepped forward to endorse this book. Can everyone see the bottom comment?
Yes. Yeah. Safety is remarkable. Yes.
I want to thank my wife for that comment. She can't be with us today, but I appreciate that. I've had her stay back at the house and write up a more glowing review of my book and publish it on Facebook. Next slide. This is a picture of the front page of the Global Climate Status Report. This report, again quartered publicly, is the only independent authoritative climate report in the United States. If you want to know what's happening with the climate and where the climate's going in the future, this is the only source you can go to. Regrettably, our U.S. government is not telling you the truth about the climate. Regrettably, our president is lying to us about the climate in every public presentation. I see I have some support on that statement. We'll talk about that more when we get to the president's executive order. But this Global Climate Report and Cold Sun, the book, are the only way our company pays the bills, keeps the lights on, pays the rent, and brings in a few college students from time to time to do some good research work for us. I strongly encourage that you pick up the book or go online and download either the small 26-page executive summary or the 86-page full climate report. In the full climate report, you will see 24 different climate parameters. and the status of each, whether there's a trend of global cooling, a trend of global warming, or a neutral trend. Right now, in our current third edition, recently published with some great science from other scientists on sea level rise included, you'll see that 20 of 24 global climate indicators show global cooling is in place. Only 3 are still showing warming and 1 is neutral. We expect the neutral and the warming trends to convert over within 5 years and give us 24 parameters across the board showing cooling. But 20 out of 24 is already strong enough. And of those 24, the global temperature trend and the global oceanic temperature trend have been dropping for many years now, which no one has told us, of course, certainly not in our government. And those 2 alone dictate that we have a global cooling phase in place. Al Gore hates this chart. Actually, Al Gore and I have a very good close friend who walks a knife's edge between us. He wants to support us both, but right now he's a Democrat, former representative. He's supporting Al officially. But believe me, Al Gore receives every press release, every letter I send out, assuming my good friend and his good friend gives it to him. But there really is no secret about what's happening with the climate. Every climate researcher gets the same data sets I do, can pick up the same indicators, determine the same trends. So there's really no secret among the scientific community. Now clearly you have many scientists, however, who will tell you something that is not true about the climate. And why would they do that? Anyone? Economics, money, especially in the university side. Unfortunately, many of our universities are very heavily dependent on the federal government giving them research grants. Without those grants, much of their activity shuts down. Therefore, universities, liberal or conservative, are tied to the federal government research dollar, and they must support the president right now. That's unethical in my opinion. There are many unethical scientists in my opinion, but there are many good ones, and unfortunately the good ones get thrown out with the bathwater every time we go in and we see what fraud is being committed at some of these university climate research centers. And believe me, it is fraud. It is fraud. Next slide. Here's how I feel about man-made global warming. I'll let you take a look at that.
Next one?
No,
No, not yet.
I make no boasts about it, ladies and gentlemen, in my book, in my presentations, in my newsletters and press releases that go out, and in the Global Climate Status Report. The greenhouse gas theory and CO2 produced by man has been used as a political tool since 1988, when the UN formed the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Even back then, we knew that they were going to deceive us and defraud us on the science and not tell us the truth, because the people who started that organization at the UN told us that the science didn't matter. Their acolytes here in the U.S. government, the Canadian government, and elsewhere that helped get this thing going told us they didn't care if the science was correct. They were going to push ahead with this mask of greenhouse gas theory because it gave them the chance to, in their words, de-industrialize the planet. Return us back to the caveman era. That's what they wanted to do. They said, in effect, we don't really care if the science is correct or not, because with this tool of greenhouse gas theory and man's CO2 production, we can create a better environment for the world. Very sad. They basically told us publicly that they were going to lie to us, and they didn't care about the science because they were going to decide at the UN what was right for us. And they were going to decide that the Earth took priority over human beings along the way. That has been the central political motive since 1988. Next. This is the only slide anyone needs to know to look at to know that the CO2 greenhouse gas theory is bogus, it doesn't work. And let me basically explain. Up on this chart produced by Dr. John Christie and his good cohort, Dr. Roy Spencer at the University of Alabama, Huntsville, you have 73 lines, it's actually 74 showing on the chart. 73 are from the global climate models from the UN and the US government and many leading universities that use CO2 produced by man to predict global temperature. Temperature variation is climate variation. It's that simple. If the temperatures are going up, we're going into a warm climate. If they're dropping, we're going into a cool climate. Nothing more magical about it. That's it. That's how we define it. Now you can say, well, it must happen over 1 decade or 2 decades or whatever, but the trend is the same. These global climate models are all wrong. They're all wrong. You can see in the bottom of this chart a dotted line. That's the actual temperatures that we have seen since 1980. And look at all the projections from the UN. Way up high, way up high. They've all been telling us that there's going to get warmer and warmer and warmer as long as we produce CO2. But their models are all wrong. They've always been wrong. They have never produced an accurate model. Tens of years and tens of billions of dollars we have poured into this charade to produce models that don't work. And that's the bottom line. The UN based these models on global climate produced by mankind and his CO2 production. That narrow spectrum, which is incredibly small in terms of what really creates the climate. But as you can see, all the models are wrong. When the temperature models are wrong, the sea level models are also wrong, because sea level rises as the water heats up. That's basically the primary mode of sea level rise. And of course, if the sea level temperature is going to drop, then sea levels will be dropped as the oceans contract. Basic high school science. So when we see all of these exorbitant, exaggerated climate model temperature predictions that are wrong, we know that the sea level predictions are wrong as well. But this is the only chart you need in terms of evidence to go to your congressman, your friends and family, your newspapers, your TV, and say, all of this UN climate science duplicated within the US government ad nauseum under this administration is all wrong. According to the top scientists from one of the lead universities in the UK, who resigned in disgrace when the ClimateGate emails showed they were manipulating and defrauding us on the data, he came back a year later. This is Dr. Phil Jones. And he said, all of our climate models simply don't work. And that's our status as far as the UN science goes. So if that's the case, what is the good science? Where can we go to find what's really happening with the climate? And are there climate models that do work? Short answer is we do have good answers for all of those. I'll get into that. Here is, in fact, the Earth's current climate status. If you'll read down through the list, you will see of the 20 parameters I mentioned, 24 parameters, 20 are still showing global cooling. We are in a new cold era, ladies and gentlemen. Global warming, as I highlight 3 times in item 6, there is no global warming. There is no global warming. It ended years ago. We have been misled, we've been lied to by our federal government, by the president, by the mainstream media for years. There is no global warming. Global ocean temperatures have been dropping for 10 years. I'll show you the data chart. The same data that the UN uses. Global atmospheric temperatures have been dropping for 7 years. I'll show you the chart with the same data that the UN uses. But is there a theory that counters the greenhouse gas theory and CO2? Yes, there is. It's item number 7, the RC theory. I developed this when I first discovered and announced back in 2007 that the Earth was going into a new cold phase.
I see.
It's called the relational cycle theory. There are many cycles of the sun. They start with an ice age cycle of 120,000 years. There are 40,000 year cycles. There are 21,000 year cycles. But it's kind of hard for us to wait around long enough to see one of those, right? But what cycles can we see in our lifetime? That's why I came up with the relational cycle theory. It talks about a 206-year cycle, a 90 to 100-year cycle, and then some smaller ones. Right now, ladies and gentlemen, the 206-year cycle has reversed. It is the most powerful of that family of cycles. It has reversed from its past global warming and has begun a global cooling phase. And now you know why the climate is changing. A cycle of the sun, 206 years long, has now reversed. That's where we're headed. And the climate status, as you can see, we actually announced the end of global warming the 1st of July, 2008. 2008, I had a news conference in Orlando with 2 TV stations showing up, and that was about it. But I announced at that time, we already had the data in, and I had a formal declaration of the end of global warming. And yet the President comes out and tells us not only is global warming still with us, but it's accelerating. Unbelievable, unbelievable. Item number 8, very important. We could have no cooling of the oceans. We could have no cooling of the atmospheres. We could have no 20 of 24 parameters showing cooling. We could have no end of global warming if the greenhouse gas theory and mankind's CO2 had any impact on the climate whatsoever. None of these cooling indicators would be possible. There's more proof for you. All of these cooling indicators are utterly impossible under the greenhouse gas theory. Why? Because as long as CO2 goes up, and it's still going up, and it's supposed to, by the way, if you look back in history, you'll see we're still on a normal, natural growth phase of CO2. But according to Al Gore and the UN, as long as CO2 is going up, the temperatures can only go up. How many times have we heard that? All the time. For 20 years we've heard that. And yet, the Earth is cooling rapidly while CO2 goes up. That again tells us the CO2 theory doesn't work. The greenhouse gas theory doesn't work. Oh, it worked fine in a test tube, in a flask, in a lab in 1896 when it was first made popular. But when you take that outside into the atmosphere, into a planetary atmosphere that's open to deep space at 300 to 400 degrees below zero, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Marie, you've gone ahead, haven't you?
Yeah.
Actually, this is the slide I wanted to get to. Thank you for doing it. I would like to move over and pick up my laser pointer because I'll need it at this point. But basically, this is a 100-year temperature trend starting at 1914 and goes up to 2114. 200 years or 100 years of temperature. Excuse me, please. What's important on this chart is to recognize where we are. We're right in here. This is the last 20 years or so, right in here. This big chart, this is where we are in the last 20 years. This drop in temperatures was begun in 2007, 2008, exactly when I said it was going to happen. I notified all my friends at the White House, the mainstream media, all of them, in 2007 by a press release. A year later, I had the news conference, but I notified every one of them that the 206-year cycle was going to reverse within 3 years. It occurred the next year. And that steep drop is unnoticed in the last 100 years. You've never seen a steep drop in temperature like that. Next slide, please.
Are those degrees, or what is that? What are the lines reflect?
The temperature scale is a variation in temperature degrees off the average. So it's not a temperature like 76 degrees. It's a variation off the average. And the average line is shown right here at 0. So you can see we've been gradually warming, but then the warming stopped. Another very important note on this chart is for 40 years, from mid-40s to mid-80s, temperatures were dropping. 40 years they were dropping. Somehow the greenhouse gas theory doesn't account for that. I wonder why. because it doesn't work. But during that period, and right in here in 1975, we had Time Magazine and Newsweek come out with front page articles indicating a new ice age was coming. Because by then we had 30-some years of cooling temperature, and the scientists at that time were saying, oh, well, it's because of natural cycles that are bringing a new ice age. There was no discussion of CO2 back then, even though the greatest percentage jump in CO2 created by mankind occurred during and right after World War II, and yet the temperatures dropped while all this was going on. Next slide. Let's look at this a little closer. This is a 30-year trend analysis, and by the way, this comes from HAD-CRUT-4. That's a temperature data set that the United Nations uses for their global climate reports. I use the same data. There are 4 or 5 primary sets of climate temperature data worldwide that people like me use. This is theirs. But as you can see in this close-up, it came up, it stopped, and it's been dropping. Next slide. This is one of my favorite charts because it shows most dramatically when the global temperature shifted. This is the ocean temperature. It's been declining for 10 years. Here's 2003. We're now going into 2014. It'll soon be 11 years. But the global temperatures in the ocean stopped rising in 2003. And if you extend this chart down to where we are, it'll be right about here in the next version of the chart. This chart comes from our Global Climate Status Report. We have it updated every 3 months or so. So if you want this chart and all the other detailed 24-parameter charts, it's in the full report. 10 years of declining ocean temperature from the UN's temperature data set. And yet, who's told us about this? Did the administrator for NOAA step up and say, hey, I've got great news, the oceans are cooling, you don't need to worry about sea level rise anymore, it's going to stop pretty soon, or anything like that? No, we've been deceived. We've been lied to for 10 years, at least on nothing more than the oceans. Next slide. So why do we even talk about sea level rise? Well, we talk about it because in Florida, we are the most threatened state of all the states, including Hawaii, when it comes to sea level rise. Apparently, according to Al Gore, we're going to be swamped by 20 feet of increased sea level and cover most of Florida. And so that's why it's such a big matter. And it's all hogwash. And has been since day one. Where did Al Gore get the 20 feet from? Right out of the air. Even when he said it, the UN was only saying 3 feet at most. Next slide. Sea levels, the biggest threat to Florida, are actually quite stable and have been for about 2,000 years. If you look at this chart of the last 8,000 years, it rose quickly as we came out of the last ice age, but then it gradually started to taper off, dropped about 1,000 years here, but now we've been pretty much in a narrow band for the last 2,000 years. Now within this little black line, you'll see current sea levels vary quite a bit, up and down, up and down. It's a normal process. There are other cycles going on that affect that sea level rise. But we're pretty stable right now in terms of past history. That's about to change. This chart shows all of the global climate reports that have had any real impact, and most of them from the UN. They vary a little, but not a lot, with the exception of this guy, who's predicting 20 feet rise by 2100. No one else is, by the way. Look at all this. 3, 4, 2 feet, 6 feet. But no one except Al Gore is telling us it's going up 20 feet, with the exception of a PhD down in Florida Atlantic University who agrees with Al Gore. Amazing. Unbelievable that people talk about such foolishness. But if you look at the data, it varies quite a bit. Look at the last national U.S. climate assessment report. Variation between 0.6 and 6.6 feet. Now that's a factor of 10 predictive variance. I can get better odds at the casino down in Tampa. I mean, this is ridiculous. If you claim to be a scientist and you give me a prediction that's got a factor of 10 variance, that's not good science. That is not good science. Why does the government give us this garbage? It's because they don't want to lose the momentum of the threat of sea level. They want to give you huge numbers, and we'll talk about those on their chart, to scare you, to make you do things you wouldn't normally do if you weren't frightened by the lies and deceptions. Now, the Southeast Regional Council here in Florida uses a Corps of Engineers estimate, but basically they say it could rise 9 inches, it could rise 2 feet, not by 2100 like the rest of these are, but by 2060. Now that's a game of mathematics they're playing with us. That rate is almost twice the rate of the UN's latest report, which says no more than 2 feet in the next 87 years. Yet Southeast Florida Regional Planning Council, for some reason, their brilliance is so great that they have doubled that rate. And where did they get that? Right out of the air. There's no science. Unbelievable. Next slide. This is Al Gore's favorite chart. Yeah, he loves to see this chart. He loves to talk about 20 feet of sea level rise, 6 meters, and flooding most of Florida. That's why the politicians down in South Florida are scared to death of sea level rise, because they've been sold a bill of goods. And even when I go down and I speak to them and I say, wait a minute, you don't need to worry about it, it's all based on garbage science and global climate models that don't work, they still go out and pass legislation for Al Gore. They ignore the truth. Why are they doing that? For the same reasons that the UN originally started all of this charade. They never were concerned about the science. They only wanted to use it as a tool to affect social change, to distribute the wealth, to take your property, to take your property rights, to violate the U.S. Constitution by imposing regionalism for the entire South Florida area. Bring it under one planning council with ultimate control to make decisions, bypassing county government, bypassing city government, bypassing private individuals. That's why I'm so happy that I had a role in the recent St. Lucie County Commission backing out of the 750 plan, which brought in regionalism to South Florida. This is bad news what's going down in South Florida. We need to fight this and fight this regionalism wherever we find it. Next one. This is the chart that most people in Florida see when it comes to sea level growth, whether you're in Tampa, Tallahassee, Pensacola, Jacksonville, or Miami Beach. This is the chart that they're using in the Regional Planning Council that says we're going to have between 1 and almost 2.5 feet rise by 2060. And again, that's double the UN rate. Double the UN rate. But something also is important on this chart, and I'm glad they put it on there. At least they had the guts to do it. This is the bottom blue line, which shows the history and projection for actual sea level rise based on measurement, not based on climate models. What does this show us? It shows us we really don't have any concern at all. Even in a worst case scenario based on current, global, and Key West data measurement, we're only going to get a few inches of sea level rise by 2060, worst case. So why do these planners, city officials, county commissioners down in Southeast Florida give us this bogus number of 2 to 3 feet? For the same reason. They want to take control. They want to threaten us with sea level rise, and that's how they do it. Next slide. This is the cumulative global sea level chart as measured by satellite data. Now let me make one big distinction here. If you go out and you measure global sea levels by tidal gauges, which are actual observations on the ground or in the water in this case, it's a very different chart. In Miami on August the 21st, when I had a news conference, I had one of the world's foremost sea level experts, Dr. Niels Axel Morner from Sweden, join us by Skype, and he spoke from charts that we had from him. And it showed that if you use tidal gauges, not global satellite measurements, you'll find there's little or no growth whatsoever in sea level. Now, this is basically us in this room, and we hear a noise outside in the lobby. And some of us say, oh, well, that's an elephant running through the lobby. Because my models tell us that's what an elephant sounds like when it runs through the lobby. But we could also go out in the lobby and find it's a couple of children who are staying here and they're bouncing a basketball going down the floor. That's an actual observation, and that's the difference. Observations always are superior science. That's what science is about. Observation, correlation, prediction, theories that reflect those observations. The UN for 23 years now has been using climate models and no effective observations to model those climate models. Everywhere they say we should see something, we don't, based on the climate models. But when you talk to Dr. Morner and others who actually go out and measure temperature, go out and measure sea level, and he has measured it all around the world for decades, he will tell you there's little or no growth in sea level. But from a science standpoint, we also have to consider other data sets. This data set of satellite data shows that sea levels are still going up. What it also shows, and it's hard to see on this particular chart, but for 2 years, this rather normal growth of about 3.2 millimeters per year stopped. From 2010 to 2012, we had no growth in sea level. It actually declined 6 millimeters. Why weren't we told that? Why didn't we see that on the evening news? Why didn't, again, the NOAA administrator or the NASA administrator say, hey, we've got great news, sea levels have been dropping for 2 years? They're not going to tell you that because it doesn't go with the agenda. Yes, Agenda 21. But it doesn't go with the UN's climate agenda. It doesn't go with the political agenda, which only wants to hear about global warming events or extreme weather events that you can try to blame on global warming. Next slide. This is the proclamation, the declaration we issued during the news conference in Miami. I'll let you read that. What this declaration says is by the middle of next year and no later than 2020, a short few years away, global sea levels will stop rising altogether and begin a dramatic and rapid drop. And they will do so because the oceans have reached a point where the cooling is so severe that the oceans will contract. Furthermore, it says that this contraction will go back, according to satellite measurement, 25 centimeters from where it is now. According to actual ocean measurements, it will be less than that because there's been only a few inches of rise. But according to the 25 centimeters, roughly 2 feet, all of that will disappear. We will be back to where we were 200 years ago in terms of sea level. Dramatic reduction. So for the last 200 years that the Earth has been warming, and it was supposed to, according to the relational cycle theory, from 1830 to present, sea levels have been rising. But they're going to start dropping, and they won't begin to come up again until 2040, and even then only moderately so. The next global warming era won't be till 2070 or 2090. Between now and then it's going to be cold. And between the 2020s and the 2040s, it will be bitterly, dangerously cold for human beings on this planet. Sea levels we see now are at their peak. We will not see them again at this peak for the rest of this century, perhaps much, much longer. And based on the proven science of my relational cycle theory, the sun is going to dominate this planet by cooling it, by cutting back on its energy that it gives off and making us colder. And we're never going to see sea levels like this again, certainly no one in this room. And most likely your great-great-grandchildren will never see it. And let me talk about the role of the sun before we go to the next chart. The 206-year cycle of the sun brings us warmth and cold, just like any cycle. The reason it's doing that is because the sun is going into what is called solar hibernation, like a bear that goes into a winter cave and stays there and reduces its energy output to survive. That's what the sun is doing. Ladies and gentlemen, the sun is going into a dramatic, historic, never before recorded reduction in energy output. This was my discovery back on the 26th of April at 2 p.m. in 2007. I realized what was happening with the sun after completing some solar physics research. And I was so convinced of my finding that I announced it in a press release, notified all my friends in the White House and again the mainstream media what was happening. Didn't even bother to check whether another scientist had discovered the same change in the sun. The science was that good. It has still been that good. NASA and NOAA have finally come back in the last year and agreed with my research and my predictions. This is fundamental to understanding climate. I came from the space program community, so a very technical career path, but I've never been doing anything in climate science until early '07. And yet, in the space of a few months completing some research, I came up with a handful of predictions about what was going to happen with our climate that went against everything public at that time. And yet here we are 7 years later, and all of my predictions have come to pass. It is the leading list of correct major climate predictions in the U.S. No other scientist has such a record, public record. Do other scientists know about it? Yes. Have many other scientists predicted the same thing? Probably. But they aren't standing up and talking about it. For the same reasons you're already aware. Most of these are university scientists. They don't want to see the president cut their research budget to zip and fire a lot of people, because that's what would happen. Most of these people are careerists still. They're already working. They're not supposedly retired like I was way back when. But they want their tenure. They want their credibility perceived or to be maintained. And if you're a scientist, a career scientist, credibility is everything. Probably true for any discipline, but in the scientific community, if the rest of the scientific community thinks your work is garbage, then you personally are garbage. That's how they look at you. It's a very sad battlefield to play on, but that's the way it is. Every scientist wants to be a Nobel Prize winner. He doesn't want to be condemned by the rest of his scientific peers. And that's why scientists don't stand up and make predictions. They indicate or suggest is their favorite word. They suggest that this is coming, or they suggest that this may happen. But effectively, no one has stood up, as I did back in '07, and said, these are the following things that are going to happen with our climate. Oceans are going to drop, atmosphere is going to drop, global warming is going to end, the sun's going into hibernation, and most importantly, the Earth is going into a record dangerous cold era that will affect everyone. Next slide. This is the mathematical formula in a chart form that shows the 206-year cycle. Let me start off. The last time the solar hibernation happened was back here in the early 1800s. As you can see where this chart started, if you extend that down, it's right about 50. And this chart shows sunspot counts on the left versus time. Sunspot counting is how we measure climate change in the solar physics community. Unbelievably, ladies and gentlemen, I can teach every elementary and high school science teacher to predict the climate by simply counting sunspots and by following one of the cycles of the sun. The 90 to 100 year, there's a 60, there's a 20, there's a 9, there's a 4, 6, and a 2-year cycle. There's also a 206-year cycle. There's a 420-year cycle. There's an 860-year cycle, and on and on and on. But the one that we need to be concerned about now is the 206-year cycle. This is the chart for it, and you'll notice it started here. That means the next 206-year cycle will bring us down to another cold era in the year 2031. That was the date I predicted back in '07. I issued a research paper and actually published the paper in the following year in January, but had already told everyone it was going to be 2031, based on my math. Mr. Vukcevic in England created the formula for me. And notice how it goes up and down, but in here, in the early 1900s, we had a big dip in sunspots. Guess what happened back then? We had record cold weather across the globe. A lot of the records that we're seeing being set, for example, in August of this year, we had a 66-degree high temperature in Atlanta in the middle of August. Now, those of you who've been to Atlanta know there's no way you can have a high temperature in Atlanta at 66, but we did. It broke a record set in 1914. This is happening all the time, ladies and gentlemen, but your newspapers and your TV forecasters and your weathermen aren't going to tell you these things unless you follow very closely. They'll pass over it, they won't explain it. But a lot of records we're seeing right now in here are the same thing that happened back over here. We're right at the same level of sunspot counts. We're now at a sunspot count level that's 100 years lower than it was before. Therefore, our temperatures are 100 years in sync for setting new records. But we're on a long downslide. We're here, we're going way down in the next 2 decades to a bottom. Now, sunspots and temperature are not a one-to-one, except when it's cold. The cold cycle I'm predicting in 2031 is the bottom of the sunspot cycle. The sunspot cycle low for the 90-100-year cycle was also a low temperature point. And likewise back here, the last time we had a solar hibernation. The last solar hibernation was from 1793 to 1830. Our country was brand new. There were only 5 million people in the U.S., non-natives, or natives not included. Just 5 million. But it was so bitterly cold that thousands of people starved to death and froze to death in New England, which was pretty much all we had of the United States back then. Unbelievable. And most people lived on farms then, didn't they? They were self-sufficient. They had lots of wood, lots of meat, but they couldn't grow any crops. The crops were destroyed by the cold. And that's the threat we face, ladies and gentlemen. It's coming around, and it comes around every 206 years. Go back in history, it's the same thing. Historian John D. Post said the last time the solar hibernation hit, he didn't call it that, he called it a cold era. During this period, from 1793 to 1830, was the world's greatest subsistence crisis. People around the world starved and froze to death. They couldn't raise crops. Crops got frozen out in springtime. And that's going to happen again. Next slide. This is a close-up view of the period reaching by sunspots, the 2031. Now, what the sunspot curve you're seeing here is a slow average curve. This doesn't really occur slowly or on an average unless you chart it over a long period of time. It's actually up and down, up and down, up and down, all the way down until you get to the bottom as far as sunspots go. As far as temperatures go, here's what's going to happen. We're going to drop off a cliff here fairly soon, stay cold for 2 decades, and then quickly come back out in the 2040s. During this same period of time, we're going to see several ill effects, like we always do during these solar hibernations. Number one, we're going to be subjected to extreme cold weather events, like happened before. In August of 1816, we had snow throughout the U.S. in August. It froze off and killed what little crops there were left, which had already been frozen out twice before. Anyone who's been in farming, my grandfather was a farmer, they'll tell you, you might survive a bad first planting or a bad second planting, but when you get into May with that third planting, if you haven't got anything growing, Katie bar the door. And that's what happened back then. Even third plantings got frozen out in June, July, and August. And that's what we're going to see again. The third effect that happens during these cold eras is we have our worst earthquakes and our worst volcanic eruptions. Unbelievably. Ladies and gentlemen, our solar system drives our climate. And our solar system and the planets that move around the sun alter the sun's behavior. And that's why we have these solar cycles develop in the first place. It's all about the sun and the sun's movement. The sun doesn't stay in the same place all the time. Every 120,000 years it shifts a little. And now you know where that cold ice age cycle comes from that's 120,000 years. It comes from the sun moving its position ever so slightly, but that's all it takes. Our Earth, as we have heard, is in a true Goldilocks zone. Not too hot, not too cold. Just right, at least for humans. And in the last 10,000 years, during the intervening warm period between ice age cycles, we have thrived. We have done very well. We have populated. Boy, have we populated. During the last solar hibernation, there were only 1 billion people on the planet. In the intervening 200 years, there are now 7.2 billion, and by 2031, there'll be 8.2 billion. Another billion will join us within 2 decades that it took all of human history up until 1800 to produce. That's how much we're populating this planet. Next slide. So here's what's going to happen in the next 30 years. Highly variable and extreme weather events. Now, we're having these, they're called Typhoon Haiyan that just wiped out much of central Philippines, Superstorm Sandy, forest fires, extreme tornadic events. The global warming community tells you that's man-made. It's all caused by global warming. It's all hogwash. They have no evidence whatsoever. They're just pushing that agenda again to stay in power, to keep these programs going, and they're really scared that they only have a small window of time left to do it. They've really taken advantage of the sun going up to peak. But now that the Earth is cooling, the oceans are cooling, the atmosphere is cooling, they know that it's only a matter of time before the extreme cold wipes out their global warming agenda altogether. We're heading into 30 to 40 years of cold, the worst cold in 200 years, worse than your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, and your great-great-grandfather saw. No one on this planet's alive that has seen the kind of cold we're about to see. Crops will be devastated. Since our country was formed, we have begun to develop crops and new technology. That's why the U.S. and Canada is the breadbasket of the world. We ship so much food overseas. I can tell you right now, by the 2030s, we will stop all shipments overseas. We will have not enough food to feed our own people. All of these foreign aid packages that you see, all of the charities that take food to other countries, it's going to stop. It's going to end. Because we are going to run out of food. The northern wheat, corn, and soybean belts didn't even exist in the last solar hibernation. Now the whole world is dependent on them, and now they are going to get wiped out. In the 2030s, we will lose 100% of those crops. Between now and then, and even after the 2030s, into the 2040s, we're going to start seeing major cold crop damage, which will cut back our crops 10, 20, 30%. Not 100% until we get into the real bottom cold era. But even that's going to be devastating. We can't afford that loss right now without changing our lifestyle. We're going to have to change. We're going to have to adapt. A lot of people won't believe what I'm saying, or it's already too late. We're going to have crop damage, and as a result, we're going to have panic in the street. We're going to have our grocery stores wiped out overnight by looters, by people who are going in to buy whatever they can, whatever's on the shelves. That's how these things start. All you have to do is go back and look at history. What happened the last time? People rioted in Europe. They killed each other. They robbed granaries. They robbed the kings and queens' granaries. They attacked grain convoys on the farms to the cities. They never even got food to the cities. That's why the French had a revolution in 1789. They had the peak of warming, immediately followed by rapid cooling. They had massive hailstorms that wiped out what was left of their wheat crop. They had no wheat, they had no bread. That's why they rioted, and that's why we have a new France today, because of a solar hibernation. And now you know the rest of the story. By the way, if it hadn't been for that solar hibernation and the French government changing over, there wouldn't be a U.S. government today. The French sent a few warships to our aid during our revolution of 1776 that knocked out the British ships that were supplying the British land forces. They did the same thing again in 1812. The British landed huge numbers of forces on our land, burned down the capital in 1812. But fortunately, they were in another war with France and Britain. The French fleet was no longer helping us in the U.S. directly, but they were holding the massive, ominous British fleet at bay in the oceans of Europe, fighting there. If the French hadn't done that, all of those ships would have been here bombarding us and unloading tens of thousands of troops. There would have been no U.S. then either. So one can look back in history and say, well, if it hadn't been for the French, we wouldn't be here. If it hadn't been for the last solar hibernation, the French government would not have been there for us either. Ladies and gentlemen, governments are about to fall again, because people won't believe what I'm saying. There aren't enough John Caseys telling the truth around the world, unfortunately, and very damn few in the U.S. Pardon my French. We're going to see significant loss of life, more so than since the Great Plague, when 30% of all Europeans died. We haven't done any final calculations. I've done some rough estimates on the death count for the next solar hibernation. I don't want to talk about it. It's pretty grim. It's pretty grim. We may be issuing a research report on that at some time in the future, but I'm going to be very cautious. It's really bad news. We're going to see cold weather deaths, people freezing to death. We're going to see people dying from riots. We're going to see people dying from warfare, and we will have many wars break out when the food starts to disappear. The politicians, the leaders of various countries will blame other countries, and they'll go invade them to steal their food. That's how it works. That's what people have done historically on this planet. People will starve from the lack of food. We're going to have the worst volcanoes and the worst earthquakes since the last solar hibernation. We'll talk about that. Disease follows these events, as you know. And there are going to be two kinds of cold weather that we're going to face. Ladies and gentlemen, this is our future. It's only going to be one of two kinds. We're either going to be similar to the way we were the last 206-year solar hibernation, which we call the Dalton minimum, 1783 to 1830, or it'll be like the one before that, which was 1615 to 1745. That was the solar hibernation before that. If we have as cold as a Maunder minimum at 1615 to 1745, the death will be biblical in scale on this planet. Next slide. This guy thought he could defeat science. He had his own figures of what the Russian winter would be like when he invaded. He took 600,000 troops into Russia during the last solar hibernation. He came back with only 40,000. Many deserted, many froze to death on the battlefield. He didn't have a climate science advisor telling him about the 206-year cycle. Next slide. The world's largest recorded earthquake took place during the bottom of the last solar hibernation. Mount Tambora, 1815. It occurred in Indonesia. And here's the island. And here's a close-up of the island. That caldera in the middle of that volcano is 10 kilometers across. That's how big that volcano was. When it exploded, it changed the Earth's climate, which was already at the bottom of the cold cycle. It made it much worse. That's why we had frozen crops in the middle of August. To give you an impression or a scale of the size of this volcano, you all remember Mount St. Helens, right? In 1883, by the way, which is when this building was built, we had Mount Krakatoa explode, also in the Indonesian archipelago, right in here, very near Tambora. It was 10 times more powerful than Mount St. Helens. It also changed the climate for a few years. Mount Tambora was 10 times more powerful than Krakatoa, 100 times more powerful than Mount St. Helens. Can you imagine that? 100 Mount St. Helens exploding at the same time. What would that be like? It was so powerful that the sound went around the world. People heard the explosion of Mount Tambora on the other side of the planet when this thing blew its top. It had many prior explosive eruptions, and then it finally blew itself to smithereens. Next slide. I'm running over time. Do I have a few minutes left? This is a picture of Mount Puyehue in South America. Very few people know about this, but it shut down all air traffic between Australia and South America. Unfortunately, our news media doesn't even recognize South America, and most U.S. news media don't even know there's a Europe, quite frankly. It's all about us, and unfortunately that gives us a very poor picture of what's happening with the rest of the world. Mount Pinatubo exploded in 1981, and Mount Katla, this one up here, is about to explode. And when it does, it will shut down much of Europe. I can't tell you when.
Where's Mount Katla?
Mount Katla is in Iceland. Previously, we had its younger sister explode 3 years ago, and it shut down all air traffic in Europe. Next slide. This is a picture of the New Madrid Fault right here, south of St. Louis. And there's another fault zone, the Wabash zone, just north of it. But this is the big one, the New Madrid Fault. At the bottom of the last solar hibernation, within a year of Mount Tambora, the New Madrid Fault ruptured heavily. The worst series of earthquakes in in human recorded history. Nothing has happened like it since. The worst earthquakes on our planet, recorded earthquakes, occurred right here in the central U.S. We don't understand the exact mechanism that ties these volcanic eruptions and these major earthquakes. I wish we did, but unfortunately we're throwing away so much money into Al Gore climate research that we aren't putting money where we really need to be. Could we have solved breast cancer? Could we have solved cervical cancer with that $30 billion just the U.S. spent? I think so. Yet politics decided, that's not as important. We want to push this political agenda and lie to our people to do so. And yet, what could we have done with that money? $100 billion has been spent globally by some estimates. We could have solved all of those cancers and gone to the Mars colony and come back with that money. Politicians. Will this happen again? If it does, it will shut down much of the U.S. economy. The central Mississippi region has many important bridges that cross the U.S. It carries train traffic, massive amounts of truck traffic, communications traffic, gas pipelines, you name it. If this happens again, you can't go back in, as they couldn't go back in then. We had 3 magnitude 7.5 to 8 earthquakes within 3 months. Unbelievable. That means you cannot go back in and build something. It'll be torn down with the next earthquake. You simply can't go in and rescue people unless you remove them completely from the region. Because you can't take them to a hospital is going to collapse again. The power is going to go out again. Hundreds of thousands of people will die, millions of people will be displaced if this happens again. And yet, the governor of Missouri, the governor of Arkansas, Tennessee, and Indiana aren't doing anything about it because it's not on their political agenda. And when I've tied it to the next solar hibernation to them, they don't want to hear it because it doesn't fit the politics of the day. Next. This is a picture of the Japanese earthquake. I predicted we were entering a new phase of major historic earthquakes 10 months prior. Issued a press release. Because of the work that I've done in climate science with these other scientists, I was approached in September of 2011 by some of the world's leading earthquake prediction experts. They said, we like what you're doing. Can you do it in earthquake prediction as well? We're all here, we need you to organize this. So I did. I put them all together into one company. The world's best scientists and geologists in earthquake prediction, with the exception of a few Russians, are now in the International Earthquake and Volcano Prediction Center. It's my sister company in Orlando. And we have predicted our first 3 major earthquakes in a row. Ladies and gentlemen, science is about to change whether the establishment wants it to change or not. We now know we can predict climate change. We now know we can predict earthquakes, the worst ones. It's now time that that be recognized. Next slide. Okay, the last 3 charts in the presentation talk about some recent developments, and I'll just go over these quickly because you all have been very kind in listening to me, but it is getting late. November the 1st, the President decided, okay, I'm going to take all my client czars and all my agencies and throw them into one climate management entity. The Council on Climate Preparedness and Resilience. Amazing where they get these names. But I have issued a rebuttal on this, and I have called it Rearranging the Deck Chairs on His Sinking Climate Ship. In the back, if you'll look back there where I'm pointing my laser, you'll see that rebuttal that I wrote on the President's executive order, and it tells him exactly what he needs to know about the climate. And actually, if you want to use it, just that one letter, which you can download from my website at no charge, and spread that around, it pretty much says what's happening with the climate now. And on the same chart, on the left, we're going to talk about the next slide. This is the letter that went to Attorney General Bondi. 15 organizations, 15,000 people have requested she investigate man-made climate change abuses here in the state of Florida. We believe, and I believe I can prove, if ever called on to testify, that a number of organizations and officials have intentionally lied to us about the climate, knowing that the climate wasn't warming, knowing that the oceans were cooling, on this matter of sea level rise and whatever, in order to take control through regionalism and to dominate Florida politics. I don't think you should lie at all, much less to take control of people's lives. I could go on, but basically, because of what the President has done, he has failed to recognize how bad things are going to get. Let me go to item 11 here. He's ignoring international scientists' warning about a new little ice age. Now, I'm saying it's going to be as cold as the Dalton minimum. The little ice age occurred in the Maunder minimum, 2 solar hibernations before. Let me direct your attention back to the chart in the back. This article here talks about scientists from the Russian Academy of Science telling us, the world, that a little ice age is starting next year. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope not. I hope it's only as cold as what I'm forecasting, but again, if we have a little ice age, then again, biblical impacts on human existence. But all that's being ignored. I will tell you something so unbelievable. My father would roll over in his grave, is rolling over on his grave. My father fought in the Korean War and World War II. I was an Army officer for a while. All of the children joined the military. But in Russia, the former communist Soviet Union, scientists are allowed to tell the truth about the climate. here in the land of the free, in the home of the brave, they're afraid to do so. How sad is that? Tragic, tragic. Yet Russian scientists routinely tell us it's going to be another little ice age. It's not going to be just another Maunder minimum like it was in the 1800s. It's going to be like it was 400 years ago. Excellent. Therefore, what I have been saying and what others have been trying to do is change all of that here in the state of Florida. On November the 4th, a letter was sent, November the 6th, it was drafted on the 4th. November the 6th, it was actually delivered to Attorney General Bondi. And it basically outlined many aspects of malfeasance by Florida officials using this fraudulent man-made climate change. It recommends an immediate halt to all man-made global warming legislation and recommends an independent outside expert panel be convened to investigate everyone, starting with Governor Charlie Crist. You may applaud if you like that. Actually, it says go back and look at everyone that had a role in forcing the charade on us. It doesn't say Charlie Crist. I'm just speculating who might be called on. Since he started the Florida version of it, the other governors in other states started their own man-made global warming version. Excellent. Thank you all. It's been a pleasure. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Since the ocean temperatures are lower or becoming lower,
Yes.
does that mean there would possibly be fewer hurricanes?
The question is, if the ocean temperatures are dropping, will that mean fewer hurricanes? The answer is no. Over history, we find there's very little variation in the total number of global cyclones. However, the intensity does lower. Yes. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
The EPA, which I hate, and the closing of the coal mines because of the CO2, is this again false?
It's all false, yes. Mankind's CO2 is 1/20th to 1/40th of what nature creates every year. So it's insignificant compared to what nature creates. We obviously can't do anything about nature. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to make a comment that do we really think that Al Gore is concerned one iota about any of this because he made his money?
I have to agree with you. He is a born politician, literally. His father was a senator. His mother pushed him to become a senator as well. And even back in Tennessee, where my late mother lived, not far from his house, they don't like him back there. He didn't even carry his home state in a presidential election, because they know it. Yes, ma'am.
How does the melting of the ice caps fit into this? Because Antarctica and Arctica, they're just getting smaller and smaller.
That's what they want you to believe. That's what they say, yes. The truth about Antarctica is for 30 years now it's been getting colder every year. For 30 years now it's been adding more and more ice every year. Right now we're having record cold and record ice created in Antarctica. We've been lied to for 30 years about Antarctica.
I was something on television last night about it.
I know. My favorite magazine, one of them, is National Geographic. I know Gil Grosvenor, the chairman, know him personally. I have tried to convince him to tell the truth about the climate. He won't do it. Why wouldn't he do that? Money. It's because the vast majority of people that buy National Geographic are environmentalists or people who want to believe that global warming is real. Yes, ma'am.
They're wondering how much your book is, the people that are having to leave to go back to work.
I appreciate that. And I don't know if the lady who walked out with one.
She paid.
She did. Curious. They are 15 each, cash or check, made out to SSRC. And I've got that on a piece of paper. I'll be glad to sign those for you, and I'm sorry if next time if she sees me, I'll be glad to sign her book too. Thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure meeting you and speaking with you today.